Let us turn back the hands of time to the fateful month of October in the year 1347, a moment that would forever change the course of human history. The setting is the bustling port of Messina in Sicily, where the golden Mediterranean sun usually gleams upon the gentle waves of the blue sea. 12 Genoese trading galleys drifted aimlessly into the harbor, their sails tattered and their movements strangely sluggish against the current. The people of Messina gathered on the stone docks with excitement, expecting exotic spices and fine silks from the distant lands of the Black Sea. As the ropes were thrown and the ships were secured, a heavy and unnatural silence seemed to descend from the decks, stifling the usual cheers. The dock workers who boarded the vessels were met not with the greetings of sailors, but with a stench of decay that assaulted their senses instantly. A horrific sight awaited them on the wooden decks, where the bodies of sailors lay twisted in agony, their skin blackened by gangrene and dried blood. Those few who were still clinging to life were barely unrecognizable as human beings, delirious with fever and covered in mysterious black boils. These terrifying swellings, oozing blood and pus, appeared in the armpits and groins of the sailors, marking them as carriers of a deadly curse. The people of Messina realized too late that they had welcomed death itself into their home, and panic spread through the crowd like wildfire. Harbor authorities immediately ordered the fleet to be cut loose and expelled back to sea, but the invisible executioner had already disembarked. The rats on the ships, carrying fleas infected with the bacterium Yersinia pestis, had already scurried down the ropes and into the city streets. Thus began the reign of the Black Death, a pandemic that would claim the lives of half the population of Europe in just a few short and bloody years. The disease moved with terrifying speed, sweeping through the narrow, crowded streets of Messina before moving north to the rest of the Italian peninsula. It was a catastrophe that ignored all boundaries of class and status, striking down the wealthy merchant in his palace and the beggar in the street. The symptoms were the stuff of nightmares, beginning with a sudden fever and chills that shook the victim's body so violently they could not stand. Then came the buboes, painful swellings the size of eggs or apples that erupted in the lymphatic nodes, turning black as the tissue began to die. Internal bleeding caused dark blotches to appear all over the skin, giving the disease its terrifying name and marking the victim for certain death. The breath of the sick became so foul that family members could barely stand to be in the same room, yet they had nowhere else to go in their small homes. The Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio witnessed this horror firsthand in Florence, leaving us descriptions that still chill the blood centuries later. He wrote that the victims would eat lunch with their friends and family, only to eat dinner with their ancestors in the world beyond by that evening. The speed of the infection was incomprehensible to the medieval mind, which had no understanding of germs, bacteria, or the mechanism of contagion. Doctors of the time were helpless, armed only with ancient theories about the imbalance of bodily humors and the alignment of the planets and stars. They prescribed bizarre and useless treatments, such as bloodletting, which only weakened the patient further, or bathing in vinegar and rose water. Some desperate physicians even suggested pressing a plucked chicken against the plague boils to draw out the poison, a practice that saved no one. The iconic image of the plague doctor emerged during this time, a figure of dread clad in a heavy waxen coat and a mask shaped like a bird's beak. The beak was filled with aromatic herbs like dried flowers, mint, and camphor, intended to filter out the miasma or bad air they believed caused the disease. But these doctors were more often heralds of death than healers, their presence signaling that all hope was lost for the household they visited. As the death toll rose, the social fabric of Europe began to unravel completely, with fear overriding the deepest bonds of love, family, and duty. Mothers and fathers, paralyzed by the terror of infection, were known to abandon their own children, leaving them to die alone in their cribs or beds. Husbands left wives, and siblings turned their backs on one another, fleeing into the countryside in a futile attempt to outrun the sweeping shadow. Priests refused to administer the last rites to the dying, fearing that the breath of the sick would carry the fatal pestilence into their own lungs. The dead piled up in the streets faster than they could be buried, and the air of every city in Europe became thick with the smell of decomposition. In major cities like Florence and Paris, the graveyards were soon full, forcing the digging of massive trenches to hold the thousands of daily corpses. Bodies were stacked in these pits like layers of lasagna, with only a thin dusting of dirt separating one row of the dead from the next row above. The consecrated ground could no longer hold the volume of the dead, and the rituals of mourning that defined medieval life were abandoned entirely. No church bells rang, no tears were shed, and no prayers were chanted, for everyone expected that they too would be dead within a matter of days. The psychological toll on the survivors was immense, leading to a collective trauma that would reshape the European psyche for generations to come. In their desperation to find a cause for this apocalypse, people turned their eyes toward the heavens, believing the plague was a punishment from God. They believed that humanity's sins had become so great that the Almighty was scrubbing the earth clean, just as he had done with the biblical flood. This belief gave rise to the flagellants, groups of religious zealots who wandered from town to town, whipping themselves in public displays of penance. They marched in long processions, stripping to the waist and beating their own backs with leather thongs tipped with sharp iron spikes until they bled. They chanted hymns and called upon the people to repent, creating a spectacle of blood and fanaticism that mesmerized and terrified the onlookers. However, these wandering bands were often vectors of the disease themselves, carrying the infected fleas from one community to the next as they traveled. The Church initially tolerated them, but soon the Pope realized they were undermining his authority and declared them heretics to be suppressed. But as the prayers failed and the processions did nothing to stop the dying, the fear of the people turned into a blind and violent rage seeking a target. The darkness in the human heart sought a scapegoat, someone to blame for the invisible poison that was destroying their world and their families. Tragically, the Jewish communities of Europe became the victims of this hysteria, accused of the impossible crime of poisoning the chaotic wells. False confessions were tortured out of innocent people, leading to horrific massacres in cities like Strasbourg, Basel, and throughout the Rhineland. In Strasbourg alone, thousands of Jews were rounded up and given a choice to convert or die before being burned alive on a massive wooden platform. These pogroms were some of the darkest moments of humanity, where the fear of death drove ordinary people to commit unspeakable acts of cruelty. Meanwhile, the plague continued its relentless march, crossing the English Channel on merchant ships and striking the British Isles with devastating force. It reached London in the autumn of 1348, turning the crowded, unsanitary streets of the medieval capital into a vast and overflowing morgue. From England, it spread into Scandinavia, carried by a ship that ran aground in Norway after the entire crew had perished at sea from the sickness. By the time the pandemic finally began to subside in the early 1350s, the map of Europe had been forever altered by the sheer scale of the loss. Estimates suggest that between 75 and 200 million people died across Eurasia, with Europe losing up to 60% of its total population. Entire villages were left completely empty, with no one left alive to close the doors or tend the fires, eventually being reclaimed by the wild forests. Fields that had been cultivated for centuries lay fallow and overgrown, as there were simply no peasants left to plow the earth or harvest the grain. The feudal system, which had bound the peasantry to the land and their lords for hundreds of years, began to collapse under the weight of the shortage. With labor suddenly scarce and valuable, the surviving peasants found themselves with a new power to demand higher wages and better working conditions. The lords, desperate to have their lands worked, were forced to compete for labor, effectively breaking the shackles of serfdom in many parts of the West. The blind faith in the authority of the Catholic Church was also shaken, as the clergy had proven unable to save their flock from the wrath of God. This questioning of ancient authorities and the realization of life's fragility planted the seeds for the intellectual awakening that was to come. The obsession with death permeated the art of the period, giving rise to the danse macabre, depicting skeletons dancing with kings and peasants alike. This artistic movement served as a reminder that death is the great equalizer, stripping away all earthly titles, riches, and pretensions of power. Yet, in a profound irony of history, this unimaginable tragedy cleared the way for the rebirth of European civilization in the following century. The abundance of resources for the survivors and the need for labor-saving devices spurred innovation and a rise in the standard of living for many. The focus on the human body and the failure of old medicine prompted a new interest in anatomy and observation, laying the groundwork for modern science. Universities that had been closed or emptied began to open again, filled with a new generation of thinkers who were less afraid to question tradition. The Black Death was a crucible of suffering, a fire that burned away the old world and left behind the ashes from which the modern world would rise. It teaches us a somber lesson about the vulnerability of our species, but also about our incredible capacity to endure, adapt, and rebuild from ruin. As we look back at those dark days of 1347, we see not just the horror of death, but the resilience of life that refuses to be extinguished completely. The silence that fell upon the docks of Messina eventually broke, replaced by the sounds of a Europe that was changing, evolving, and moving forward. From the darkest valley of the Middle Ages, humanity began its slow and painful climb toward the light of the Renaissance and the Age of Discovery. The ghosts of those millions who perished still whisper to us through history, reminding us to cherish the fragility of the civilization we have built. Their stories, etched in the boneyards and the chronicles of survivors, stand as a testament to the endurance of the human spirit in the face of doom. So ends the tale of the Great Mortality, a chapter of shadows that serves as the grim foundation for the luminous eras that were destined to follow. We remember them not just as statistics in a history book, but as mothers, fathers, and children who lived, loved, and feared just as we do today. And in their memory, we recognize that even the darkest night must eventually yield to the dawn, bringing with it the promise of a new beginning.